Yeah, started.
Great, thanks. Yes, so as I was just saying, so welcome everyone. First, we are going to talk about what's new in Inventor, then Fusion 360, and then about Vault. So luckily, we have two engineers from the Vault team as well with us, who will talk about what's new in the Vault API. And then I guess you can ask them questions as well if you have any at the end of the presentation. So first of all, what's new in Inventor 2020 API? Each year we are starting with this, comparison between the various releases. So as you can see, this year around there are not many changes concerning the API because most of the functionality that the focus was on the product side were not really affecting the APIs. And we are only going to focus on the API as usual. What's new in the API. But I'd like to point out that since you are ADM members, you have access to the beta site, which is now called the feedback.autodesk.com. So you have access to various resources, loads of videos about the actual product features if you're interested in those. And it even has a link to the actual documentation for the latest release of Inventor with a section on what's new that you can also have a look at. Through a web browser, you have access to the latest Inventor and you can play with it as well. So I do suggest, having a look at this site if you haven't done it already. Yeah, so for the reasons I just mentioned, there are not many changes actually in the API, but let's go through them. So basically, we just added support for the various features that became available in the products itself, like the unwrap feature now has support in the API. Same for the sweep solid API. Also like the thread feature. And another thing is that if you have your own UI elements in Inventor and you want to make sure that it will have the exact same look and feel as all the internal palettes and components, then you can use now these properties to access them through the theme manager. So you have access to the various background colors and text colors that you can also use in your own components. Here's a kind of vague feature. I'm not sure how many people this affects. I'm assuming there was some internal add-in maybe which required this functionality on the browser panes. When getting a native browser node, you have now extra options. And we also exposed quite a few settings which are available in the application options. As you can see, the presets, place and ground first, and also enable spell checks and spell check options. These are all available now through the API as well. And now you can track changes in planar sketch and 3D sketch as well. So as you may know, the document itself has a sort of checksum that you can use in order to identify if there was any change in a given Inventor document or in the geometry inside the Inventor document. Now you can also check if a specific planar sketch or a 3D sketch has been changed since a previous thing. So you can just store this checksum if you want to keep track of changes in these in sketches. You can do that. So it's just a higher granularity for checking changes in Inventor. And that's really it on the Inventor side. So does anyone have any questions? I'm just checking the QA panel. So I guess in the UI, there should be an option where you can either use the QA feature, or I think there's also like a chat feature that you can use if you want to.
There is one question from Alex.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Name geometry in part files. Any additions to the API to allow us to automate the creation of them? Name the geometry in part files. What do you mean by name geometry? I mean, as as I guess you're aware, you can use attributes like for tagging any objects really inside the document. So what would it provide beyond that? The API to allow us to automate the creation of them. Oh, I'm not aware of an API feature for that, so I would have to check if it has been added for 2020 or not yet. Okay, anything else from anyone? Okay, so in that case, let's go on to the Fusion part, which is actually even shorter, because there's only one real change inside Fusion 360 that will affect your add-ins, if you have any written for this product already. So inside the user interface, they will be adding tabs. Actually, so this, first of all, there's a comparison between the current UI and what's coming in a later release. So as you can see, tabs have been added for sorting the various features inside the various workspaces. And currently, you can just access it through the application's preferences. So under preview, you can select the UI preview, and then you can play with this feature. So recently they actually added a functionality to make sure that existing add-ins will function more or less correctly under using the new UI as well. So if you're just as an example, as I'm showing it on the slide, if you're placing your command under the sketch, then it will automatically be migrated under the sketch tabs create part. But just to make sure that everything is working fine with your add-in, the best thing is to enable this feature in the product and then make sure your add-in is working as expected. And that's really it on the Fusion side. So any questions concerning Fusion 360 API? It's possible to write public debug symbols for Fusion 360 because debugging add-ins is very painful in C++. Well, this is something we could probably log. So have you logged it already on the what you call it, the idea station for Fusion 360? That could be one place. Otherwise, we can also separately log it as a request in our system internally. But it might be easier to get support from other people as well in the community if you post it on the idea station, and then hopefully loads of people will back it up, and then we can make it available. Any other questions? Okay, well, in that case, we can move on to the Vault side of things. So I just stop sharing my screen, and then Jeffrey, you can take over. Jeffrey. There you go. Okay.
Okay. So we had a few API changes on the Vault side, and most notable of those would be that we did quite a few changes with numbering schemes.
So you may have to speak a little bit louder.
Okay. Can everybody hear me okay like this?
Yeah, this is much better.
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. So from our existing methods, we had a few that were kept, but they were moved over into a separate service, and I'll cover that more in detail later. To start off, we do have some currency changes. So we did have a numbering scheme object before that was utilized. In this case, it was updated, and we added 3 new members to it. We have entity class ID, provider, and reuse num. And the entity class ID will kind of propagate through all of the other methods that we have as well. It's our more concrete way of identifying what entity the number scheme is representing. The number provider object is new, and that goes hand in hand with the new custom numbering provider support that we've added. And that has 3 members as well, one for display name, one for whether or not the number provider is the default provider, and one for the system name. Typically what you'll leverage in the API is the system name, but what you'll see in the Vault client is the display name. And there's a small note here that I wanted to add, that when configuring your number providers, typically the first provider will be your defaults, and that will also be covered later on in the slides. So moving on, we had a few methods across the document, item, and change order services that were retained, but they were moved into the new service. And that includes these methods here. One for activating and deactivating schemes was consolidated into one common method. And get numbering schemes by type was replaced by just get numbering schemes. And that will leverage the entity class IDs. And amongst the rest, they were simply updated with new parameters. So we have add numbering scheme, delete numbering scheme unconditional, set default numbering scheme, and update. So moving on, we have these new methods here. These are our get methods. So you can get the numbering providers, which will just return an array of all the numbering providers currently configured. We have get numbering scheme by ID, which returns a matching numbering scheme object. And we have get numbering schemes, where you can pass in an entity class ID and the numbering scheme type, and it returns an array of all matching numbering scheme objects. Next, we have our set methods. So we can also now set a default numbering scheme per entity class ID. And as a small note, the file entity class is one of the classes that can have no default set, but right now it's the only one that supports that. Moving on, we have our create and update methods. So we have add numbering scheme, and this one has quite a few new parameters added to it for the general service. We have the entity class ID, the scheme name, and we have the new provider name, which comes from that num provider. We have num scheme fields to uppercase and reuse numbers. So the name, the fields, and to uppercase will move over from the previous APIs. Reuse number and provider name will be somewhat newer. There is a caveat for the reuse numbers. In some instances, it may not support number reuse if it contains certain fields. So that's also covered in some of the later slides. Moving on, we have the update numbering scheme. So we have the scheme ID, scheme name, provider name, fields, to uppercase, and reuse number. So in this case, we replace the entity class ID by the existing scheme ID, and we can update all parameters with that. If a numbering scheme has already been used, then the last 2 parameters, to uppercase and reuse numbers, will not be able to be modified. And that's for consistency's sake. Okay. Moving on, we also have delete methods. Let me see. I apologize about the low voice. I have my microphone turned up to max, but it seems it's a bit quiet still.
It seems to be okay on my side.
Okay. All right. So moving on, we also have the delete methods. In this case, we have delete numbering scheme unconditional as a new method as well. So the delete numbering scheme as a standard method has some restrictions where if it's in use or if it's specified as a default, it'll throw an exception or raise a restriction. With the unconditional, those restrictions and exceptions are ignored, and regardless of its current state, it'll just be removed. Okay, and then this is the method that was consolidated from activate and deactivate. Enable numbering schemes, you can pass in an array of scheme IDs and define a Boolean whether or not you want those schemes to be enabled or disabled in bulk. And as a return, it'll return an array of all of the numbering schemes that were either enabled or disabled. Now, we also have a completely new method for this year in the API. And this one is the ability to add an item revision with a predefined numbering scheme. So here we've added one more parameter. In addition to the category ID, you can now define the numbering scheme ID. And then item revision will generate a number with that scheme ID. And the purpose for this was we had some people who, when they added an item revision, would want to change the number for the item to be generated by a different numbering scheme. But in order to do that, they had to create the item first and then create a new number and then switch over the number. So this allows for a little bit of a cleaner numbering history, and especially for cases where reuse numbers is disabled. So this is the caveat that was mentioned previously. With reuse number, if the numbering scheme contains a free text, a predefined list, or workgroup label field in the numbering scheme fields, numbering reuse cannot be enabled for that scheme. Moving on. The new web service for all of these new methods besides the item method that was previously mentioned, it'll all be consolidated into a service called numbering service. In addition to this, we also have new events. We have folder lifecycle states, including pre, post, and get restriction events, as is common with the other events. And this is a complement to the update file lifecycle state events that are currently existing. And this one can be called with the document service extensions .update folder lifecycle state events, similar to other events that we currently have. Along that same line of work, we've also added change order versions with events for update file lifecycle definitions and update item lifecycle definitions. The method's functionality itself hasn't been modified in any way. We've just added events with the methods called. Okay. And going back to the biggest change that we're presenting in the API this year is the ability for end users to create their own custom numbering providers. So in this case, we now have a new binary, the autodesk.datamanagement.server.extensibility, and that's included with this year's SDK, and that will expose interfaces and types that are required for people to create their own numbering providers, specifically the iNumber provider interface. And once these custom providers are built and you're ready to put them onto the server, they can be configured in your server's web/services/web config file, as shown in the image below with a number provider node. So in this case, you can define the name, which will be the system name, your types, and whether or not it can be cached. And we also have a new node under the number provider called initialization parm. So basically, you can add a parameter here that you want to be passed in during initialization of your custom numbering provider. And inside of your provider, you can manipulate that data or utilize it however you'd like. And I do have an example at the end of how you might use it. As a side note, for the numbering providers, the first numbering provider listed in this web.config file here is always considered as the default provider by the server. We also have an example of the custom numbering provider. We have a sample in the Vault 2020 SDK as well. Okay, so we have a question whether or not the custom numbering providers are inside the UI as well. And yes, once you configure a custom numbering provider, you'll have to use the iNumbering provider interface and create that assembly. Once you put it on the server, you can also access that from the Vault client. Okay, so moving on to the interface. The iNumbering provider interface exposes these four methods. The first one is generate numbers, which consists of a number provider response array. And from this one, we also have a number of responses that you want to generate at the end. For this one, for however many numbers you specify you want to generate, you can create your own custom response with your own generated number to reply back with. And this is really the meat and potatoes of the iNumbering provider interface. It's where your custom numbering generation will take place and be returned to the server. Next, we have getDisplayName, which is really just a friendly name that's returned by your custom numbering provider. And this is also where DisplayName is populated in the number provider objects. And then we have this init method. This is where the initialization parm nodes, those values get populated into there as the parameters. And you can utilize those however you see fit. And the last one is whether or not the request is supported. So here's just a small example that's very simplistic and doesn't really have any error handling of any kind. When this custom numbering provider is initialized, if you have that first initial param node, you can populate it with a string, let's say ABC. And so that will be the first object in that parameters array. And you can use that however you see fit. In this case, I used it as a prefix to our actual number being returned. For the generate numbers section, I have a list of number provider responses. And while our number that we request to, the number of responses that we request to generate is more than 0, we simply just increment our number. It seems to be missing from this sample, but we would increment our number and have the number prefix with that response as well. For the get display name, you can simply return a string. And is request supported, you can leverage that within this code as well. If you see that in some instances it may not be a fulfillable request, you can return an error code failure as well from the number provider response to signify to the server that that request could not be fulfilled. And I believe this was our last slide here. Yeah, so does anybody have any questions?
Looks like no questions.
Okay. So then I will stop sharing my screen now.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Jeffrey, for the presentation. So another thing that, this presentation was recorded. Do we know where exactly it will be posted, View?
It will be in ADN extranet till the product is released. Our products are released except for Fusion. Like in Vault, when it gets released, we will post it to YouTube. Till that time, the videos will be in the ADN extranet.
Okay, thanks. And I can see, Jeffrey, there was a question in the meantime. Have you seen it in the Q&A panel?
I do see it, yes. The copy design function. Will the copy design function support the custom numbering providers? I don't believe so, but I think for this question, Paul might be able to better answer that.
Yeah, so it actually should. The way it works is when you create your numbering scheme, you select the appropriate provider. At that point, that numbering scheme can be used wherever you want, including copy design. So there should be no problems with that.
Okay, thank you, Paul.
Yeah, there's one question on mentioning these changes. Yes, that till the product is released, these changes, these are under the non-disclosure agreement. Any more questions? Once we post this recording to ADN extranet, I will send the email to every registered participant, so you can take a look at the recording.
Yeah, so any final questions from anyone while we're still here?